Hey everyone, welcome back to Old World Legends. We're going to quickly jump into our part 2 of special rules. So Evan, let's pick it back up, sir.
All right, so the next one is fight next to rank. So what this lets you do is it lets you make a supporting attack from an additional rank behind that first one. Just
Mm-hmm.
important to note that a supporting attack means it's just one attack per model. Doesn't matter how many attacks are on the profile.
Mm-hmm.
And these models are still part of the number of models who can be removed by the opponent before they could actually swing. So there's something I kind of talked about this later, but generally speaking, these are pretty much just on spearmen. Fight next rank isn't a
Mm-hmm.
very common ability to come off from like a spell or something like that.
Not in this
Um,
edition, no.
well, not yet. There are rumors that the Beastmen are going to have a spell in their lore that gives them fight next to rank, which is going to be
Well,
interesting.
we're talking about the edition right now as it stands today.
Uh huh. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but mostly it's for spearmen, and then basically instead of just the front rank get to fight, then the second rank gets to fight too. Important to note though, for like things like a Saurus spearmen who have two attacks each, that the guys in the front rank are the ones who are removed first. So you go from like let's say three of them get killed and they're five wide, and two of them get to swing back with their two attacks, and then all the guys in the back only make that one supporting attack, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's the biggest difference. And also keep in mind with the supporting attacks, it's to the front ranks that are engaged. If you're going to get flanked or reared, you're not going to get those supporting attacks like you'd want to. So again, it's
Unless if
great
you're
when
high
it happens.
elves.
That's true. If you are a high elf, you are more special because elves are elves, and you could do that. But generally speaking, you have to. It's going to be in the front rank that this is going, or front facing of the unit that this is only going to be applicable.
Yeah. Also keep in mind it doesn't say it here because it's not part of this rule, but spears don't give you fight next strength when you charge the other person. So sometimes there's a
Hmm.
situation where the spearmen are both just sitting there facing each other, not wanting to fight because if either person charges, they're at a disadvantage, right?
Well, spears hurt. Yeah. Ow. Ouchie.
So here we have another fun movement rule that combos up with a lot of those other things. So fire and flee means
Hmm.
that you're allowed to make a stand and shoot reaction and shoot at the other person and then flee afterwards, which is cool.
Hmm.
The only downside of this is that you don't flee as far, so you roll 2d6 and you pick the highest dice. However, if you have Swift Stride, you still get to add another d6 on top of that. So you still could go a total of 12 inches if you have a Swift Stride, Fire, and Flee unit, for example.
Hmm.
For
Yep.
example, I
And they
think
do
Dark
have.
Riders have that.
Yeah. So again, it just gives you how many things are you really going to kill with units that have fire and flee? Not a lot, but again, it allows you to. You already were going to do a flee, so it's definitely a one of those contextual tool units, right? That you want to use in the right position to bait out the enemy positioning and all that jazz. But again, you also get potentially one or two pot shot wounds off. It just makes that a little bit more effective, which is nice, rather than the unit is just fleeing. So not a ton of things happen. You're typically going to see this on like those fast cavalry type units. Is typically where you're going to see units that have this role.
So, a couple things to point out. First of all, if you have Fire and Flee and Feign Flight, then you can Fire and Flee and then automatically rally. Secondly, Fire and Flee is an
Good bump up.
amazing way to let you not flee as far if you don't want to flee very far, like if you're going to flee off the table. So if you're very
Hmm.
close to the board edge and you can fire and flee, gives you a way to not roll those 2d6 and go up to 12 inches. If you're within 6 inches of the table edge, or if you're outside of 6 of the table edge, then you definitely won't go off the table. So that's good. Third
Hmm.
thing, it can make you not flee as far if you intend to be caught and run down in a very specific spot. So if you have a unit of 5 Empire Archers and you do a fire and flee reaction to a charge, you only have to go that d6 instead of 2d6, which means you can allow them to flee at a very predictable spot, like 3 or 4 inches back from wherever they are, get
Hmm.
caught and run down, where the enemy then stays there. And as soon as you've done that, you've basically put them in a place where maybe you can charge them, cast magic on them, something like that of that nature. So having something unit that can fire and flee gives you a lot of control that you wouldn't necessarily think of originally.
Hmm. Yep, absolutely. So again, it's really about the movement, positioning, control. It's not about the pot shots. The pot shots are just a nice bonus.
Yeah. Okay, so first charge. The first charge you make in a game with these units will remove the rank bonus of the enemy. So
Hmm.
this means that if you declare a charge and the enemy flees or whatever, or you fail to make the charge, that counted as your first charge. That was it. You didn't that. So then this rule has no effect. So it's important to be careful with this because if your unit does have this and you have the option to not charge, like if you're not Impetuous or something, then you might want to hold back and not charge a really long bomb that the other person has to flee from because then you might waste
Hmm.
this one and only opportunity to get that first charge in.
Yeah, and typically you're going to see this on cavalry units is the most common place for this. It is on other things, and again, it's a great combo if you're trying to beat the enemy unit through combat resolution. If you could tag team this with something else, because again, you can't always necessarily charging something in the flank, especially versus a skilled opponent, is hard to pull off, right? So this allows you to get some of that. If you were flanking them, bonus to remove their ranks. Again, this is a great combination to do that. So keep in mind, cavalry units typically, and this is very thematic with them, they want to hit something real hard and then move on. Cavalry units typically don't want to hit something and get stuck in combat, right? So again, this is both the thematic flair and some mechanics that are presenting it, and really opens up, gives cavalry sometimes that slight edge they need to deal with units that have a lot of combat resolution, through rank bonuses, banners, and other things like that before the combat starts. So that's typically where you're going to see it. But as Evan pointed out, be careful because it is a one-time only thing and it's the first time only. So your opponent can manipulate that against you just as much as you can use it against him. So choose wisely.
Okay, next we have flaming attacks. So if attack or a special or a magic item or a magic spell or something says it has flaming attacks, it means they are flaming. And this has really only two effects in the game. The first one is that if the enemy unit is flammable and they also happen to have a regeneration save, that
Mhm.
then negates that specific regeneration save. However, there are like 6 flammable units in the game, so this almost never happens.
There's more than 6, but it's very few.
So there's a
Almost all of
vampire
the
lord and
flammable,
then the
well,
Tomb
all the
King Darius
vampires
Dust
actually.
guys.
It's not the vampire lord. So yeah, the
Yeah.
units the where this is most applicable is specifically picking on my poor vampires or any vampire adjacent unit. So it's the vampire lords, the vampire thralls, blood knights, the vargeist, any of the vampire character things are regeneration and flammable. So for some reason, the vampires in this edition are filled with oil or bloody oil. I don't know, and so that's the where this comes into play the most often. Evan's right that in terms of in this edition, it used to be applicable to so many more things like wooden constructs in previous edition were susceptible to this. That's really not a thing at all in this edition. So it's
The
very
tree
narrow
spirits
what this
are
affects.
flammable, but yeah.
Yeah, but they don't have all that big regen. So again, it's there, but you would typically where you'd see this in previous edition is typically you would have used it versus trolls and monsters in previous editions to
Well,
get
trolls
rid of
are
the
flammable still.
regeneration.
Yeah.
They are, but again, it just doesn't come into play that often.
Well, the main reason why it doesn't come into play is the second thing it does is that there's a lot of units in the game, far more that are flammable, that actually have ward saves against flaming attacks specifically. So Phoenix Guard have a 5+ ward save versus flaming attacks, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas actually better than their ward save against any other kind of attack. So if you use fireballs against Phoenix Guard, they actually have a better ward save than any other time. So
Yeah,
um,
castors have saves versus flaming attacks. There's actually quite a few things in this edition. Again, it's not a ton, but there are just if the addition of this affects less things, and there are more things that have flame resistance, just means we just don't see that very often in this edition.
there's no reason to go out of your way to give yourself flaming attacks.
No.
Okay. But then things just happen to have it, like fireball. They just happen. Oh, it has flaming, by the way. Guess what? I get a word save. Cool.
Oh,
All
to
right.
Evan's point, the second thing this was applicable against was against beasts. It causes fear in them.
Yeah. No
Talk
one,
about something
literally,
that's
no one will ever remember or care to do that because almost every beast or swarm in the game has immune to psychology. Or sorry, almost every
Mhm.
swarm has immune to psychology, so they don't
Yeah.
care.
Nope.
Secondly, a lot of the war beasts are not going to be outnumbered by anyone who causes flaming attacks anyway. So who cares? Also, the war
Yeah,
beasts
it
generally
really
don't want
doesn't
to
matter.
charge you; they just want
Or
to sit in
or
front
the
of you.
war beasts are often a sacrificial unit anyway. It's a 30 point get in the way speed bump. So again, just the terms and conditions, the way that they constructed the rule, they've toned it down in this edition to the point where it's just not very applicable.
This rule always makes me think of Indiana Jones, the first one, where he's got like the torch and he's trying to keep the snakes away. That's
Yeah,
this. All right.
except it doesn't work for snakes in this edition.
Well, who has snakes? Nobody has snakes. Jungle swarms or
Don't
jungle
listen
swarm
to me.
snakes?
Yeah, jungle swarms. Yeah, there's some
Are they
snakes in
do they have regen or are they flammable?
there. It doesn't matter.
Okay, so then there's flammable, which is it's just a downside. It's just you have vulnerability against flaming that you lose your regen. You know what's funny? Yetis have flammable, and Yetis don't have regen.
Well, again, I think that's another legacy They stopped working on the book, and doesn't make a lot of
There's a
sense.
spell that gives us a unit regeneration, but why would they make a unit specifically have flammable just so that if you ended up casting that specific spell on that unit, that it would then go away?
In case Yetis are overpowered in the meta at
They're
some point, I
not.
have no idea.
They're not.
Again, they stopped working on the book. That's the reason why.
Okay. Fly. So probably top three most powerful rules in the game. So
For
first of
sure.
all, you can move over other units with this. That's
Huge.
crazy. Secondly, fly is
Follow
almost
the trend,
exclusively a
right?
higher movement value than anything else you're going to get. Like fly 9 or 10 is really, really common.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who has fly
Mm-hmm.
6? Nobody. You know? Um,
That swarms.
they have fly 8, I think.
I'm gonna look it up. Keep reading.
Okay. But anyway, fly is almost exclusively 8, 9, 10, 12 for Steel Shadows, for example. So it's almost always way faster than any other kind of movement. Um, You can freely pass above other units in terrain. They can still march within 8 inches. So you know what's super annoying is like surrounding something that flies with enemy units that are about to catch it and be like right next to it and be like huzzah, and they want to march so that they can run 20 inches away. They don't even have to take a stupid test. They just get to do that. That's so annoying. I think that's
That swarms
broken.
are movement
So
7,
annoying.
fly 7.
Okay, fly summon. There we go. That's the worst fly in
So
the
I
game.
thought 6, you thought 8. We're in between.
So fly, you can just leave and yeet yourself out of there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and you only have to take like a dangerous terrain or difficult terrain test if you end on top of that, so you can fly over it. You're just
Mm-hmm.
fine.
Or take off from it. It's only
Yeah.
when you land in it. It's not when you take off from it.
Okay, but then probably the most common misconception about fly is it does not mean you're hovering. So unlike in Total War, your gyrocopters are not just immune to being attacked by guys with axes. You actually fly over things and then you just land and sit on the ground for them to potentially charge and or shoot you.
Yep, taking hops. Doesn't matter if you're a gyrocopter, doesn't matter if you're a dragon, doesn't matter. There's no fly high in this edition or any of those fancy rules. It effectively allows when you're moving, it allows you to get that benefit to fly. And there are things that shut down fly, and there's counters to fly, and there are things that have anti-fly and so forth and so on. But even with all those negatives, it's still so powerful and very prolific, and it definitely top 3 most powerful rules of the game. Because again, we said movement is so critical. It is, you win and lose games in the movement phase, and this literally makes your movement 4 times as good as if you were on the ground.
Pretty much. You could also use fly on an overrun, pursuit, flee, any other kind of move. So that's annoying. Okay. So frenzy, one of my least favorite rules in the game, and one of the reasons for this is because everyone will probably, as if you're a newer player, imagine that this is really, really good, and it's actually horrible. The reason for this is because frenzy gives you a double-edged sword. It's +1 to your attacks while you're frenzied, but you also have to charge anything that's in range of you at all times. So that's a big problem. Frenzy, one thing that's really I think perhaps forgotten about it is that it does make you immune to psychology in a sense, because you are past fear, panic, and terror checks, so you just totally ignore that. But the fact that you have to charge everything that is ever in range of you at all means, all I have to do on my turn is move a unit within your range, and I know exactly what you have to do, and I can plan for that. And when my units have evasive or feign flight or fire and flee, then I can put my unit in front of your frenzied unit and know I guarantee you have to charge me, and I can stand a shoot and run away out of your charge range.
Mm-hmm.
You also can't flee as charge reactions. There you go.
Yeah, frenzy again. Frenzy is has the great benefit of, right, you're immune to psychology, which can be very beneficial, but also restricts your options. So you lose the tactics of choosing to flee. So it can also be a huge detriment. And also being forced to charge. Again, I get it's very thematic. It's very fun. It's totally in the theme and tone of the old world. And it's just sometimes fun to just have an all frenzied, army just screaming as they rush across the battlefield. That being said, in terms of, competitive play, it's not a competitive rule because it's too easily exploitable. The downsides are massive, and it's very easy for the opponent to take control of your army away from you. So again, I love the concept of frenzy. I think they maybe tune this a little bit too far, and how much control the controlling player loses over their units. So hopefully we'll see some revisions to that. If not later this edition, maybe next edition, because
I think it
it's
actually
really, really
works
fun and
really, really
thematic.
well because I get to punish people for doing it. And I think that's great.
Yeah, and that's the problem again, because I like to see players. I guess my big concern with it is it's so the downsides are so meaningful that so many players just say, I'm not going to take this unit because it has frenzy, and that makes me sad, because that means there's a whole bunch of really cool units I'd love to see on the battlefield we're not seeing on the battlefield because they have the frenzied rules. So I would like GW to tone this down, the downsides, so that we can see people start taking those frenzied units again.
So also never being able to make a restraint test is interesting because that means if I charge you with some moron like a single model and I'm just like the one guy left from a unit of archers and I charge into the frenzied unit, I can just don't care he's gonna die, but I can then force you on that turn to then they're gonna have to overrun, which might mean they used to be facing something they wanted to kill, and then I charge you
Mm-hmm.
with something, they have to turn to face that thing and then overrun after where it was, and now they're in a totally different position now.
Yeah,
They're not in the right spot anymore,
yeah,
and they're just somewhere else. And they're
and
like, oh, we're
and the
facing the wrong way, right?
and the downside of you always have to pursue is one thing, and that, yeah, that's a downside, but it's not the worst. Honestly, I think if this rule was just toned down to, if they have to charge, take a leadership chest to not charge, and if you pass the leadership test that didn't charge, that to me would be enough of a change that I think people would start taking units with frenzy all over the place. But because it is a straight nope, if you can charge, you must. It is so punishing.
Well, at
That's
least
why
gives
we
you
don't see
some
as many
bonus,
frenzied
whereas
units.
Impetuous is only negatives, which is I think that's a way
True, but
worse
again,
rule in
my
terms of
biggest
yeah.
my test is always the community, right? Are the community as a whole bringing units with this rule, or are they keeping them at home on the shelf? And they're keeping them on the shelf. That means, in my opinion, the rule is too punishing.
That makes sense. It's also not as bad if you're only like infantry because your charge range isn't as far. So if you're cavalry with frenzy, you have a big problem because you can just run off to the middle of nowhere.
Or a monster. Yep.
Yeah, like the Gorgon is a big example of that. He's really cool, but he has frenzy, and so it's so easy for him to just go chase. I call it chasing butterflies. You just put a single great eagle or something in front of him, and now he has to charge after it. And then the next turn, he's still facing the wrong way, keeps charging after it. Next turn, still facing the wrong way. So it just creates a cycle of you just did nothing the whole game. You just chased butterflies, right? Okay, back to some rules that are only good things. Furious Charge. So if you made a charge over 3 inches, you get to have +1 attacks. This is very, very good. A lot of things have this rule. And because this rule has the 3 inch restriction, I very often like going, and I just march my units with 2 inches from you. Because I'm very, don't want that to happen. Like, for example, the new Empire Knights of the White Wolf, they all have Furious Charge. It's so bad to be hit by 2 attacks instead of 1 that I'm just going to march within your 2 inch range so that you just don't get this. That's how important it is for me to make you not get this, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep.
The fact that you have Countercharge and Furious Charge together on Pegasus Knights is one of the reasons why they're so insane, because they almost always, 2/3 of the time, go the 3 inches on their Countercharge.
Yeah.
And then they get to
And
have the extra attack. It's like, this is stupidly good.
it's too powerful, but there are ways to counter it, and again, we're not going to go too deep into it here,
Yeah.
but effectively, because Pegasus Knights exist and have this combo, and there are other things in the game that have this combo that are very powerful, you need to start, if you want to compete with those units in the meta, one of the ways to compete is you build armies around a structure and strategy of, you need to absorb the charge, which means you need a bumper unit that can absorb that furious charge, and then afterwards you attack it with something else where they're not going to have that. One simple example is, again, I do a lot of my undead is I'll have a big brick of Graveguard. Now my Graveguard still don't want to get hit by that peg unit with Furious Charge and all the buffs turn 1. That really hurts. Ouchie, right? But if I put some Fell Bats literally in front of them, well, my Fell Bats are not 3 inches in terms of their movement tray, right? They're only a 40 by 40. So if I literally have them touching the front of the Graveguard unit, the Pegasus Knights slam into the Fell Bats, cool. They obliterate the Fell Bats. they explode. Well, they could choose to stay there. They're not going to, or if they go into the graveguard, that means the distance that they would overrun into the graveguard is less than 3 inches. They're not going to get the Furious Charge bonus. And so the next turn of the combat, that Pegasus Knight unit losing that +1 attack for all the models from Furious Charge is a huge delta and reduction in their efficiency output. So you can, again, build one of the strategies is to build ways to absorb it so that when they do the overrun, they're not going to get the Furious Charge. That is one example. We're not going to go into all the others here, but you need to be aware of it. Very, very powerful. As long as they don't go that 3 inches, they're not going to get that benefit. So find a way to take that away from them.
And the same thing is true for impact hits. I much more often find myself, I'm just going to march in within that 3 inch range so you just don't have it anymore. I very often do that because I often play units that are, like elves where I have move fast and I don't necessarily have, a bunch of guys I can sacrifice to sit in front, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like that sibling thing where they put their hand in front of your face. I'm not touching. I'm not touching. That's basically what you're doing with that strategy. I didn't
Yeah.
charge you. I didn't charge
I
you.
call it hugging the chariot. So hugging the chariot is when you march within that 3 inch range and now the chariot doesn't do what it wants to do anymore.
Yep, but it works. So sometimes, right, the best strategy is to absorb. Sometimes it's get in their face.
All right, so the next one is hatred. Hatred's also great. So you just get to reroll a hit in combat versus something you hate on the first round of combat. The first round of combat happens a lot because you often either kill the thing, don't have to overrun, or don't have to pursue, and then you can just on your next turn charge it again or whatever. So the first round can happen. I'd say the first round of combat is like 70% of the time. So
Yes.
happens a lot. A lot of things do have hatred all enemies, which just means you just reroll a hit versus everybody on that first round. And Dark Elves have eternal hatred, which means when they fight against High Elves, they actually get hatred on every round.
Yeah, I'd say as a whole, hatred is incredibly powerful. One of the most powerful rules in the game. The reason why it doesn't make the top 3 list is, again, it's not very common. It's hard to get it. Typically, magic and dark magic is one of the best ways to get it with the battle lust rule. So not and again, the units that have hate specific thing, like they have hatred and they hate a specific thing, there's just not that many of units in the game that have that. There are a few units that have hatred everything. We went to Evan just gave an example there. Strigoi Ghoul King is another example of hate everything. But keep in mind it's only in the first round of combat, so very, very powerful. But it has its limitations. Just not that common.
Yep. Okay. So Horde, this rule is a lot of people were very afraid when they're coming from 8th edition reading this rule. They're like, oh no, please no, not do what it used to do. It just lets you have your maximum rank bonus be 1 higher than whatever it normally is, which is usually 2 for regular infantry, goes up to 3. So you can have up to 3 ranks of guys. When you combine that with Warband, then it means your leadership can be improved, and not just by +2, but by +3, which is really important when you're Night Goblins who have leadership 6 or 5.
Important thing that people
4.
mess up here, it's you may get 1 more to the bonus if you have enough ranks to claim that additional bonus. It's not just you get the bonus just because they have the rule. You still have to bring enough models to claim that additional bonus.
Yeah, but typically Horde units are like 8 points per model or less, so you generally just have 30 of these dudes anyway.
Yep, if typically you're taking 30, you're pretty much good to go.
All right. Something to say about this is that the way I've set up the objectives rules for our tournaments is that, rank bonuses are your capturing power. So Horde units just naturally have a higher capacity to capture than other units. So if you see Horde, well, great, that means more objective control, right? So that's something to look out for.
So as we see, I do believe we're going to see more objective-based play, not just in our community, but in other communities out there. It's definitely getting a lot of traction, and this is where Horde is going to become an even more powerful thing to use to allow you to get that slight edge to claim those objectives.
So the next one is Howdah. So this is representative, this is a word that's I think it's a Middle Eastern word, and it refers to having an elephant and having this platform where the fighters would sit on top of the elephant and shoot arrows or throw spears down from on top of the elephant. So this is referring to this kind of split profile and firing platform rules. So it allows you to essentially treat whatever you're riding very similar to a chariot, where you can see in all 360 directions for shooting, and you also have that split profile rule. Out of the rulebook, it also has this weird thing where you actually attack against the rider's weapon skill instead of the monster, which I think is probably unintentional with the rules as written. And this can happen when you have weapon skill 2 goblins riding on top of a what is it? The big Yeah, the Arachnarok Spider.
Spider,
And the Arachnarok Spider
Arachnarok
has like
Spider.
weapon skill
Yeah.
4, but if you have weapon skill 2 goblins on top, rules is written, the Howdah rule means you attack the goblin's weapon skill, so you just hit it like on 2 pluses all the time, you know?
Yeah, I think this needs to be FAQ. We did FAQ this in our Old World Legends FAQ packet. I would encourage GW to hopefully they will FAQ and update that in sooner rather than later.
And I think the reason why this is a mistake is because the split profile chariots rule says this because the chariot itself doesn't have a weapon skill. So you attack the
Yep.
crew. Of course, you attack the crew because the chariot itself doesn't have a weapon skill to swing against. But when you use the Howdah rule on, and you have somebody who's riding on top of it, then attacking the tiny goblin on top instead of the giant Arachnarok kind of doesn't make sense at all, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I
And
think that's
I think
actually just an
GW.
unintentional consequence.
I think they haven't addressed it yet because there's so few things that this is applicable to. The Goblin Arachnarok Spider is the one in the core rulebook, and of course the Skinks writing things and the Lizardman book is the other one. Beyond that, it's just not applicable to too many things. So I think that's why GW hasn't focused on it.
Yeah, and if you just get this wrong, most people just won't even correct you because it's a very awkward, weird rules interaction that shouldn't be that way. Okay, so the next
Yep.
one ignores cover. Well, this is just busted. So the cover rules come up quite a lot if you actually play them correctly, and I think a lot of people
Oh
might
yeah.
just not play them correctly. But again, cover gives you more minuses to hit, and if you just have ignores cover, that's great because it's just more actual arrows hitting the other person. And a lot of units, that are really good have this just on all the time. Things like, Sister Valorn, just ignore cover. Wow,
Mhm.
super useful.
Yeah. Super useful. Again, generally speaking, ballistic skill shooting in this edition is not super effective, which is why we don't see a lot of it. The best versions of it are in elves, specifically on some of the wood elf and high elf units, is where it is still
Or
fairly
having
effective.
70 poison archers who are ballistic skill, who cares?
Which is another right. That's a whole nother tactic. It doesn't matter that way. But that's why we don't see a ton of ballistic skill shooting. It's not super effective, and the reason why it's not super effective in the current edition is just it's so easy to stack up so many negative penalties to hit that it typically you're hitting on 5, 6, 7s. It's very hard to hit. And one of the most common area penalties is long range. I think the next most common one is cover. So the ability to ignore that -1 from soft cover or -2 from hard cover from intervening terrain, intervening units, so forth and so on, is very powerful.
Yeah, or you could just be a Tomb King and cheat. Anyway, um, immune psychology. Okay, it's cheating. They're cheating. They just said, hey,
No,
all those rules, we're just gonna not use them.
that you call it cheating. The Tomb Kings are like, why is everyone too stupid to not use ass barrows? They're so just difference of
So,
perspective.
and unironically, their special rule is literally they cheat because their special rule is their arrows are guided by their god directly into the enemy, and so it's like,
That
why
sounds like a
can't
good
my gods do
strategy.
that? I want my gods to do that.
Well, maybe you're worshiping the wrong gods, Evan.
No, that can't be it. Anyway, um, immune psychology is a funny one because the immediate benefits come more to mind than the downside. So immune psychology is you automatically pass fear, panic, and terror tests. However, you also can't flee from charges. And this is
Mm,
actually a big deal because, for example, Sister Avalorn, like I just mentioned, have immune psychology. And not being able to flee from a really long bomb charge of, like, let's say Pegasus Knights are 19 inches away from me. I actually really want to flee from that because there's no way they'll catch me if I just run away a little bit. Then I can rally, and who cares?
hmm
I got really high leadership. But if I'm into psychology, I just can't. I literally just have no
Nope.
choices.
hmm
So
You
undead
can
and
stand and
demons
shoot.
are all immune psychology. So if they just get charged, you just look at the other person like, "What's your reaction?" Then you laugh.
Yep. Yep, and that's okay. And you're like, let's move on. So yeah, immune psychology is both incredibly powerful and can also be very penalizing in terms of, again, it's removing a critical part of positioning on the battlefield to be able to sucker out the opponent's charges. So you have to do it in other ways through magic, through misdirection, through sacrificial units. But again, uh, the new players definitely get the bloodlust in them. Let's face it, even veteran players get the bloodlust in them and they want to go into the charge. But one of the best ways to control the battlefield and to position your army to fight correctly or to fight to its maximum potential is sometimes you flee from charges. And that's totally part of the strategy of the game. But if your unit's immune psychology, doesn't get to do that.
All right, impact hits. So impact hits are a bit crazy because they're one of the two rules in this game, like impact hits and stomps, that sometimes are really useful for doing damage, and sometimes they do nothing. So
Hmm.
first of all, in order to actually do impact hits at all, you have to go at least 3 inches during a charge. And so, like I
Hmm.
said earlier, you can hug the chariot. The chariot gets too close to you, march into its 3 inch range, and now it doesn't get that do it anymore. And impact hits are generally like over half the damage a chariot can do.
Yeah, and I think the biggest difference where this will come up more often than not is the chariot hits goes in the first round of combat. Boom, right? Well, more often than not, the enemy unit will give ground. They move back 2 inches. You follow up 2 inches. Well, guess what? You didn't go 3 inches, so no more impact hits.
So they happen at initiative 10. So that means they will happen pretty much before anybody else. If
Hmm.
something has strikes first and it gets killed by impact hits, it gets to still make its attacks. It's the same initiative step, so they're same
Hmm.
time.
Yep.
And yeah, and they automatically hit. That's the other thing. So you don't have to roll to hit at all. So if somebody has, ooh, cool, I have that Doom Bull who's -2 to hit. Well, you just charge him with a chariot, and you're not -2 to hit anymore. You just get hit in the face.
Super powerful. But I think the downside is most of the things that have really juicy impact hits of strength 4, strength 5, -2 AP on those heavy chariots. Yeah, this is gonna crush them. Almost always it's D6 number of hits. And, more often than not, you're rolling that 1 or 2 and womp, womp, womp. It does, it was a really great hit, but like a stomp of a monster, you roll 1 or 2 for number of hits. Suddenly your damage output isn't there because it's the inconsistency of the randomness of a D6.
Yeah, or if you're a chariot, but you're a character mounted on the chariot, and you charge somebody and they say, oh, I just want to challenge you, and now all of those impact hits go into one guy, and you just smash that guy in the
Hmm.
face, and that's it. And that whole unit
Hmm.
has Horde and Stubborn and Warband or whatever, and they just don't run away, so that one guy you killed didn't matter. And they
Yep.
give ground two
Yep.
inches, now you can't do impact hits next time.
Yep. So there are definitely ways to get around it for sure.
All right, Impetuous. So what if you were frenzied but didn't get any extra attacks?
Hmm.
I
But
mean,
at least
it's
you're
not as
not
bad.
guaranteed to charge.
Yeah, it's 50-50. You don't have to you don't have to overrun. Now, I think it would be way better if Impetuous had the reroll to charge ability that Warband actually has
If
because
it had some sort of benefit, I think your point is impetuous is purely just again one of those just negative special rules. There is no upside to having it.
yeah, the upside is supposed to be that whatever unit is on is either cheaper or better in other ways. However, it seems like to me that when they give Impetuous to a unit, they almost do nothing to what that unit costs. Dragon Princes are
Yeah.
37 points each, and they have Impetuous.
Yep, and I think this is another one of those rules similar to Frenzy that I get the theme and the tone and what they were going for this, and they were clearly trying to put this on things that would feel like they would play Impetuous, but effectively, its downsides are so meaningful that the vast majority of players simply just won't take a unit just because it has Impetuous on it, and that makes me really sad because there's quite a few units actually that do have Impetuous across multiple army rosters, and they just don't see the field of battle because of this rule. So again, I'm not here to make the case of whether this is balanced or not balanced. But my point is, it's such an impactful rule that the community as a whole typically doesn't field units that have Impetuous. They sit on their shelves at home. So I
Yeah,
think GW should take a second look at this to find a version of it that could still be a negative side, but how could they tweak it so that players will still take units that have Impetuous on them?
so case in point, every Orcs and Goblin model that's not Black Orcs or Night Goblins is
Hmm.
Impetuous.
Hmm.
And Orcs and Goblins armies are made up of Black Orcs and Night Goblins, and that's it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Gee,
Yep.
why's that?
Again, I think even if they just toned it down towards, I think there should be, to your point, some sort of upside. And even but also if it wasn't just a 50-50 chance, if it was pass a leadership test for this not to affect you, there are lots of things and methods in the game to affect your leadership or to be put in a position where this is more controllable. But just a 50-50 chance where you have no ability to manipulate that role whatsoever, people just won't take it. And it's only a downside. So hopefully GW will reevaluate this in the future.
Yeah, Impetuous should reduce the price of your unit by like 30%, but most of the units that I could think of that aren't Orcs don't have any. They don't seem any cheaper than units that don't have it.
Yeah, but price point is such an inconsistent thing. And again, the
It's very
biggest thing, I
inconsistent.
don't believe, even if people were 20% cheaper,
If
30% cheaper,
Pistoliers were
I'm not
9
convinced
points each, I would take 2 units of 5.
you would, but you wouldn't take impetuous units when players, there are a huge number of players,
Yeah,
a huge number who just will not take units they don't have full control over,
that's true.
period. Even if you make them crazy cheap. So again, I'm not a fan of rules like this because players, it's the same kind of rule set as a video game. The worst thing you can do to a player in a video game, do you know what the answer to that, Evan? What is the worst thing you do to a player in a video game?
Stun lock them so they don't get to do anything.
Exactly. Don't let them play the game. That's the worst thing you can do to a player is stun lock them or prevent them from being able to take an action. That is the worst thing you can do to a player in a video game. Similar thing to here in a tabletop game. What's the worst thing you could do to a player being able
Take
to
away their
with his
agency.
unit?
It's
Not
simply
right.
it's more, better simple way
Not
to put it
allowing the
is
player
take
to
away their
control their
agency.
unit.
Right.
That's right. So that's why I don't like these rules, which is why, and you could see it in the way the community responds. They don't take things that have these rules. So I would like it to be reevaluated.
Yeah, I think first of all, instead of it being you have to charge, and the big problem with that is charge could be like 16 inches away, and it's just I'm just gonna run off into nowhere being a whole moron. And when you charge, you can't shoot, you get kind of stuck out somewhere. So declaring a charge at the wrong time is horrible. I really would prefer that Impetuous what is that if you're in combat, you can't restrain and you just have to pursue. That's different than having to charge out in the open against nobody. It's that hey, if you do fight, then you have to follow up after them. And that's a big difference. It would be much less bad.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I think we talked this one to death. Let's move on.
Killing Blow, super fun, barely ever used, but again, Bretonnians exist, so take this.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you roll a 6 to wound, you just remove all of their wounds if they're infantry or cavalry. Now this includes monstrous cavalry, for example, or monster infantry. So if you killing blow like an ogre tyrant, he's just dead. If you killing blow a duke who's on a royal pegasus, he's just gone. He gets no armor or regen. Now that's another thing that's really important. People complain all the time, oh no, everyone has triple saves. Well, the rules designers, I believe, intended people to bring Killing Blow and Monster Slayer more commonly, so that the having armor, regen, and ward wouldn't matter very much because there's ways to just skip at least 2 of those, and they only have one save left.
I think that's true, Evan. I think the
Yeah.
biggest difference between this edition and previous editions is Killing Blow in this edition is they've split it up so that there's Killing Blow that affects effectively human-sized opponents, whether they're infantry on foot or they could be human size on cavalry. Killing blow will still work. And then things on monsters in terms of dragons and things of that sort. Now, the reason why that's a big problem is because most things in the game can only take access to one or the other, and you have to make that choice. There are some exceptions that, of course, Bretonnians that have both, but for the most part, you're choosing one or the other. And again, so now it's like, well, this might be applicable in the game I'm going into, or it might not be applicable. And typically, it's very powerful, so it's very expensive. So you might be spending a lot of points for something that might not come up in the game, or you're having to specialize a unit. The other problem from the reason why, and I think it's not as effective as it should be in this edition, is in previous editions, if you had Killing Blow, you could still cut the head off that character riding that monster
Yeah,
and still
exactly.
kill the character. The monster would still be alive. In this edition, because they combined them, you can't do that. It's like, nope, it's a monster. Therefore, you can't cut the head off the rider. And I get why they streamlined it, why they simplified it. But because they made that design choice, that makes basic Killing Blow applicable to way less things, because monsters and character and most monsters in the game are written by characters the way they've currently written the rules. Therefore, the basic Killing Blow is just not nearly as applicable as often, and now you've split what you can take and you can't take both. So again, here's the conundrum, which is why we see that triple save so effective so often, which is why people are not necessarily just saying, well, here's the obvious answer to do with it, because you have to take, and quite frankly, if you have one of the armies that doesn't have access to Monster Slayer, most armies don't, the only way they get access is the Dragon Slayer sword, right? And now you have to dedicate it to a specific character who has to hunt something down. So there's just so many terms and conditions, which is why I believe it's not as effective as it should be, and it was much more effective in previous editions. I think they went too far with dividing what it does or doesn't affect with the decisions they've made.
Um, I don't think they necessarily went too far with dividing it. I think the problem is that the weapon you get for the Dragon Slayer sword gives you no strength or AP if it's not a monster. So it's just
Right.
horrible in those cases, which means if I take this, my guy just only does one thing. That sucks.
Correct. Now,
Right?
but again, if you, let's say you're an army that doesn't have access to Monster Slayer, and the Monster Dragon Slayer sword is the only way you have access, you have one option.
Yeah.
There's not like 3 or 4 other options. There's not a spell that gives you Monster Slayer. Like there's just so many armies are restricted to this one magic item, and
Yeah.
that again is
Yeah.
very contextual, and there's not a lot of options. So
And
again,
if that
I
item
just
was
feel they've
Strength plus
restricted this.
2, AP2, and Monster Slayer for 50 points, I think you'd see it
Well,
all the time because at least
you,
it would be just as good
it'd
as
be
a
an
great
auto take
weapon.
at that point.
Well, it would be just as good as a great weapon in all those other cases, and then it would have this
Hmm.
bonus, right? Whereas
Yeah.
instead, it does jack shit unless if figures play at monster. So if you play against Bretonnia, you go, well, this is worthless. You know, if you play against
Yep.
Skaven, you're like, well, this is probably worthless. And so if you play against,
Exactly right.
and then so a lot of the time you go, man, why did I bring this? Right? And then
So
it's the same
this
thing
this is yeah.
for the axe of what's the axe that has killing blow? It's the same thing. It's 45 points. It's only strength plus 1 AP 1 and then it requires 2 hands and has killing blow. So if you buy that axe and you play against Warriors of Chaos and they have a dragon coming at you, can't do anything cool against that and you're only AP 1 now. It's like ugh.
Yeah, so this is one of those examples where there are multiple layers of
Yeah.
design space decisions and multiple layers of army selection comp decisions. This is not a very clear, simple, obvious answer. There's layers of complexity here that ultimately result in it's a frustrating experience the way it's played out right now. I'm hoping this is something they could look at in the future and just make it. There are multiple ways they could make this better. I'm not going to say which one is the right way or wrong way. I think there are multiple paths to just making this easier to handle. And I think that this is also part of the problem why we have such a character on big monster heavy meta is because the tools you use to counter that are actually not as easy to counter it as I think they were intending them to be.
Hey Mike, why don't I take a Dragon Slayer sword and then also buy a great weapon? So if I want to fight against something that isn't a dragon, I have this backup weapon.
Well, you have a magic weapon, sir, so you may not use that great weapon. You have to use your magic weapon.
See, most people don't, when they first play this game, they think, well, that of course makes sense. I'll have a weapon, I'll have a sword on my hilt, and then I'll have, an axe in my hand. I'll put the axe down if I need to use the. Like when I go to do like
Which
a hobby project, I've
in
got
previous
glue.
editions, you could do that.
So Mike, when I put my models together, I've got super glue and I have plastic glue. I have two different kinds of glue. I don't equip super glue and then forget that plastic glue exists because I have super glue now.
Yes. You were not wrong, and I think, and also on top of that, they also have exceptions to that rule, such as if you have a lance, you do use you use the lance in the first round of combat, and then you use your normal hand weapon. It can't be magical in the previous round. So again, there were good intentions. I see why they were trying to make those rules. And again, there definitely were exploits and feel bad situations in previous editions where people were not using their magic weapons, so forth and so on. But again, this is just another layer evidence pointing out why this problem it's a compounded problem.
Yeah. So instead, just get killing blow some other way, like a dark elf assassin can have like a potion that gives him killing blow, and then he can also buy the Dragon Slayer sword, so we can just have both on at the same time.
Assuming that that assassin will ever get into contact with the monster.
You hide him in a unit.
You are making a lot of assumptions, sir. You're assuming the
He
other
has
opponent.
strikes first,
Anyway,
bro. Strikes first.
we assuming the dragon charges that. Anyway, I think we've definitely gone off the deep end explaining our killing blow is very powerful, but the terms and conditions, the situations, the actual army comp that people are bringing makes it's amazing when it works, but it's just not as doesn't work as often as you would think it would or as often as it did in previous editions.
Okay. So another really confusing rule is large target. So large targets can't ever get minuses to hit for being in cover because they just don't get cover. Then the second thing is the large targets can draw line of sight over other models and vice versa. So you can see over people and you can be seen over things. However, this does not clarify whatsoever in these rules here whether large targets can see over other large targets or things like that. And for example, a lot of people think, hey, can a large target see over a hill? And no, it can't. A large target can't see over a forest either. It would be way easier if this game just had a height stat and large target gave you like, instead of that, you could just have height 3 instead of height 2, and just if you're higher, you just see over. But that's not how it works whatsoever. Instead, it's
They did do that in previous editions. They were
yeah.
trying to simplify it. But that being
This is
said,
way worse.
If they just had a caveat here that said a large target can't see over another large target, then we wouldn't have to be having this conversation. But they
Yeah.
didn't say that. So hopefully they'll put that in FAQ. If people are playing it raw, they're going to say, well, it says I can. Again, the way we played Old World Legends at OWL events is what we believe is rules as intended, which is the more fun experience for both players. So no, our large targets and our events can't screw with them. So if you have a large target you want to know, ask your event organizer at the event you're going to how they are playing that rule.
So levies is a weird one, and it only comes up a few times, like things like hobgoblin cutthroats or whatever. So these models can't use the inspiring presence of the general or the holder ground of the battle standard. However, if they flee or if anyone's basically required to make a panic test because of them, you just don't care. So it's specifically when they break from combat. So if the levy breaks and flees, everyone's like, yeah, that was expected to have happened, right? This is a weird one because it's only on a few things in the game. Bretonnian peasants have a similar rule that's not this at all. It's different. And then goblins have a similar rule where orcs ignore the panic of other goblins. So they wrote this rule in here, and then they made a bunch of other rules that are similar but do a different thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, loner is a nice is a much better version of this idea where they're going to take a kind of a generic rule that used to be all over the place and make it like one rule in one place. And what the loner rule is that this character can't be if it's a character or a unit, it can't be your general, and also you can only be joined by other characters that have the loner rule and vice versa. So usually what you see is that you have like a slayers characters are loners, so they can't join units that aren't slayers, and they also can't be the general, if that makes sense. Or, for example, witch elves. So witch elves have loner, and so do the death hag. So the death hag can't be your general, and the death hag can only join the witch elves, and vice versa. So it's a lot saves a lot of time because there used to be a lot of rules like that were very restrictive.
Yeah, and so it's just a simple way. Effectively, this is again a downside rule, and this is just a more accessible way rather than making a whole bunch of caveat statements. It could join this, it can't join this. Yeah, boom, loner. There we go. It basically can't join anything. Solves a lot of problems.
All right, and lastly, before we finish up part 2, we have magical attacks.
Mm-hmm.
So as we saw earlier, ethereal units are immune to all damage that's not magical, and magical attacks are just basically a thing that is goes through ethereal. It also goes through if people have ward saves that are only against non-magical attacks, like Phoenix Guard, for example, have a ward save that's only versus non-magical attacks, which is sad, very, very sad.
Imagine if your whole army had that rule. But we're not talking about that right now, or we can. So again, primarily, as Evan pointed out, this affects ethereal units, and the other common or things that have a ward save unless it's a magical attack. Certainly the high elf example we just gave is one, but the more common one is the legacy army book Daemons, which the whole army effectively loses their ward save that way. Again, people are playing it raw. That's the rules out of the book. Multiple communities, in particular, also our community, we've released our Old World Legends Legacy errata, where we feel this is too extreme and unintentional, literally prevents people from wanting to field the army whatsoever. So most communities we've seen, including our own, have embraced no, the demon ward save should always work even versus magical attacks. But rules as written, as they are right now, they wouldn't. That's typically where these things come into play. There are a few other instances, I believe, where this is relevant, but again, not so much. It's really those two.
Yeah, that's the main one. It's also good to point out that all spells, all miscasts, all magic items, they all are magical if they do any hits. So a miscast is magical damage, just so you know.
Yeah. And again, different people will have different interpretations about that. Check with your event organizer.
It's pretty clear when it says all spell effects are magical. So miscast is
all
a spell
effect. But anyway, this is something that has come up in multiple conversations with people who did want to rules raw interpret that a miscast, blowing up or doing damage isn't necessarily a magical attack. That is certainly not how we rule it at Old World Legends events. We have it in our FAQ that miscasts are magical and such. But again, check with your tournament organizer and make sure you're up to speed on your community you're playing in and how they're playing their rules.
All right, so we're done. We'll see you on
we
part
did it.
3.
All right, we got through part 2, so we will catch you all next time for part 3. So have a good night.